Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is episode 23 of my secular Bible study series in which we look at Isaiah. What a book. Isaiah is a book that you can make it whatever you want. You want it to be very literal? No problem. You want it to be very metaphorical? You got it. You want it to be prophetic? No problem. You want it to be about now? Great. You want it to be about a couple hundred years from now? Perfect. How about a few thousand years? Not a problem. How about we just make it about heaven? You got it. The inconsistency with which this book is read and conceptualized and applied is fascinating. There are so many different views, so many intermingling mixed messages. Well, here it is being literal, here it's not, or, oh, it's prophetic, but it's prophetic for their time and place, or it's prophetic, but for the messianic promise. Oh, that New Jerusalem is definitely just talking about a time after Hezekiah. No, it's talking about after the Babylonian exile that's to come. No way, that's talking about after Jesus has done its work. No, that's talking about the apocalypse. No, that's literally just talking about heaven, and on and on and on. So what are we going to focus on? We're going to do our normal 7 points. I'll do what I can to show you both the Jewish and the Christian and the secular perspectives. But once again, the amount of disagreement here means that whatever I say, many of you are going to feel completely different. And that's fine. We don't have to agree. I'm going to try to show you, as always, objectively what we can know about this, where some of the problems lie, how the authorship and date works, what we can see from the contextual history, how did the writers of this book apply literary techniques, what are the main themes, what was its reception amongst all the different communities, and lastly, today we'll do something a hair different. Yes, we will cover contradictions and problematic passages, but this is such a prophecy-heavy book that we will be talking about some of the prophecies in detail. My last caveat, and then we will dive right in, is that this book needs a ton of study. There's so much. We could spend an entire episode just talking about Isaiah 53. We could talk about the prophecy of Isaiah 7 for literally 30 minutes. We can get into the different readings and translations and original Hebrew and much of the context that is required accurately from the historical perspective, etc. And we're just not going to be able to do that in this overview. Just know there is much more that can be said, but I'm going to try to have you walk away from this video knowing a lot more about Isaiah than when you came. So for point 1, book overview, let's get into the structure and the people and the time and the place. It's very simple. We have Isaiah. Isaiah is a prophet. He is warning and rebuking the current kings of Judah. In fact, the book starts off saying the 4 kings of Judah that are during his time period. So we know exactly where to place them. And this is like 8th century BCE. So this is pre-exile. And he's warning about the big monster in the room. He's talking about the Assyrians. He also warns later about the Babylonians. And we know that the Assyrians attacked the northern kingdom unsuccessfully, and that the Babylonians eventually, well after the time of Isaiah, come and take the southern kingdom into captivity in a couple different waves. So during this time, before the Assyrian attack, things are getting dicey with the Assyrians, and we have Isaiah once again giving all of this instruction, kind of raising up this fear, this is what's going to happen, this call to action or change, etc., against these bad kings of the north. It's funny to me during these episodes, it always feels to me like I'm actually just reviewing a Game of Thrones episode sometimes. This is not Game of Thrones, though if HBO would like actually take the Old Testament and run with it and do it that well, it would be a story to see. But let's try not to get too sidetracked. I'm going to break down the structure of the book because it does present itself in a few different parts here, and then we'll move into point 2. So we have book 1 is Isaiah 1 through 39. And then book 2 would technically be the rest of it, and that goes through 66. But we have something called Deutero-Isaiah and Trito-Isaiah. And so there is actually 2 more sections within that second half. We'll get to that again here in a minute. Within part 1, we have kind of an introduction and the initial warnings. That's going to be Isaiah's 1 through about 5. Isaiah's 6 through 12 is going to be Isaiah's big vision of the temple. Isaiah has personal encounters about his sin, his justification from sin, a scary moment happening where he is getting burned, or purification of his sin to become righteous, sets the stage for the prophetic vision of this book, at least if you're interpreting it that way, and shows that there will be a remnant left after even the judgment and persecution. 13 through 23 is kind of a declaration against all the enemies, all the superpowers. Long story short, he is just providing judgment against these nations and also giving us kind of this geopolitical context and understanding of what is going on at the time. Now, I'm having to be careful here with which interpretation of the book I go through to explain, but I think the best way this book is taken by the modern Christian would be to continue in sections 24 and 27, looking apocalyptic, this eschatological hope where we see a worldwide judgment coming, but also of restoration and redemption. 28 through 35 is more warnings, but also promises again of future redemption to Judah. And then 36 through 39 to end the first part of book 1 is kind of this bridge for us to connect these two gaps where we are going through the history of what happened with the Assyrian siege, what Hezekiah did, what made Hezekiah good, but then how Hezekiah was also bad, and makes way for us to move to the southern kingdom and the Babylonian exile in the next coming sections. So then in 40 through 48, we have jumped to the Babylonian exile, and we are now offering comfort to those in exile, trying to give them hope of a future, a promise of redemption. We're seeing God's power over all of the nations, and we introduce the idea of this servant, or this theme of the servant of the Lord, which again, some people are going to say that's Jesus. No, that's Israel itself as a collective. No, that's a different king of Israel at the time to help see this through. Talk about a book where we just do not have agreement. 49 through 55, we get the servant songs, and it's this succession of poems that, again, are pointing to the Messiah, maybe a future king, Israel in its reunified state. Pick your poison. We also have this weird emphasis on universal salvation. It's a very strange thing, and once again, I think that Isaiah 53 deserves its own, hey, let's really break this down. Why was this not about the Messiah? How can we know that? What would it have been instead? What is the context here? What is the history here? So I might be able to give you a brief overview in point 7, but that's something I think we need to do a follow-up video on because there's just so much there. And then 55 through the end of the book, 66 is this wrap-up. Restoration, judgment, New Jerusalem, again, meaning many different things to many different people. And that's also the third part. So we'll talk about that coming up in point 2. But that's our breakdown for book overview. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully we have set the stage. Let's talk next about authorship and date. We have both of these things pretty well to a degree because of the events described in the book. The big question is, was it prophecy or not? That's going to determine the different interpretations of who wrote this book and when. The traditional idea that Isaiah wrote the entire thing would suggest that he was also indeed prophetic because he talks about things in the Babylonian exile that he couldn't have known living back in the 8th century BCE. So there is a unity of Isaiah idea that is out there with authorship, but the scholarly side usually attributes 2 additional authors or groups of authors. We have Deutero-Isaiah, which would be chapters 40 through 55, and then 56 through 66 is Trito-Isaiah. That's because the first part is during the Assyrian siege, that second part is in exile, and that third part is post-exile like the Ezra-Nehemiah time period. This is the best and most widely accepted scholarly interpretation of the authorship and dating. Once again, it's just a very difficult book to interpret, even if you were trying to take it from a Christian perspective or Jewish perspective. When is Isaiah being prophetic and when is he not? When is he using imagery and metaphor? And when is he being literal? To which group is he talking about during which period? Like there's an idea that Isaiah still actually made this prophetic jump to the second part where he's talking about the Babylonian exile, but his prophecies are for that time and place and still not for Jesus. So even if we grant that he is prophetic, that he is kind of moving through time here with his foreknowledge, how much time do we give? And so again, it's a real mess. And the way we could be talking about authorship and date and context could go in many directions based off what assumptions we make or what guesses we entertain. So I've already mentioned some things, but let's move right into point 3, which is going to be the historical context, the historical accuracy, and background. We know there are some legitimate historical events described in this book. We know from even the Assyrian sources that there was an attack on the northern kingdom during the reign of King Hezekiah, led by the Assyrian king, King Sennacherib in 701 BCE. This is a fact. Great. We have some things that this is rooted in, and it would make sense for there to be these historical pinpoints for the stories to take off from. We also know that the Babylonian exile is correct and that we had the initial fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. Great. These are our two main points during the book. And we get some great understanding here of the context and what was going on at that time. It's political upheaval. We learn about Israelite kings and their problems, about the alliances that they are contemplating making or are making or not making, about the chastisement from the religious perspective at the time, but also just the political leanings of what these kings were trying to do to keep everything together. We even have some archaeological evidences to help us with these stories, like the Tunnel of Hezekiah. There is archaeological evidence that around this time there was a tunneling project being done. We also have the Cyrus cylinder, which we've talked about, which is essentially a collected message where we know that Cyrus took over and conquered the Babylonian Empire, being a Persian, and then helped assist in the people returning during the post-exile period. Aside from that, though, we have a whole lot of missing proof, archaeological evidence we should be expecting to see and don't, and archaeological evidence that does conflict with some of these claims all being present at the same time. Again, that might be expected depending on the original intention of this book, and that original intention might also be split into multiple parts and multiple ideas. If this was a book written to be about prophecy that is yet to even happen, well, then we wouldn't expect to see certain things. But if this is a book that was about prophecy that was going to happen in that time frame or in the soon to come time frame, we have some major problems. We'll talk about that a little bit more during point 7. So there is this tension between how prophetic is this book, what claims is it trying to make, and then what would we or should we be able to tell because of it. But let's move on to point 4, literary analysis, and there's quite a bit going on in this book, but I'll try to be brief on this. First, we have a fusion of poetry and prophecy. I'll tell you what you don't want with your prophecy: poetry. That makes it much more unclear, which is part of why prophecy goes so well with poetry. Oh, it's metaphorical. That way you can take it and map it onto whatever you needed it to mean, no matter how far in the future that is. That is a very open and dangerous game to create whatever you want and back it up with whatever claim you need. Wouldn't it have been amazing if we got some very specific prophecies that could be falsified? By the way, I think we do have those. And again, we'll talk about some of those in point 7. But for the ones that Christians are still bending and turning, that, by the way, to the Jews were never supposed to be. They went hundreds and hundreds of years without thinking this was going to be talking about some Messiah or that it was going to be talking about Jesus specifically, etc. Some Jews hold that some prophecies are yet to be fulfilled, weren't fulfilled with Jesus, while others say, well, that wasn't even a prophecy in general, or that was a prophecy for the kings at that time. I mean, come on. And that's just within the Jewish conceptualization of these texts, though it is indeed the Christians who take it and stretch it the most. The next thing that you don't want in your book of prophecy that this book has a ton of is symbolism and allegory. And if that wasn't making things confusing enough, let's add in a bunch of imagery and metaphor. All of these techniques are at play in this book, and they all make the prophetic side of this much, much more difficult. Within those metaphors and that imagery, we have a lot of nature imagery and a lot of creation imagery, which makes a lot of sense when you're thinking about a people that need to rebuild. In terms of other techniques, we have a lot of parallelism, a lot of rhetorical technique. We have chiastic structure going through this. We have separate themes, separate sections. Again, the servant songs is its own very unique thing within the book. So this thematic coherence is going on, or at least trying to go on. And yeah, we just have a wide variety of literary techniques at play. It's pretty cool, actually, to see so much shoved in a book, although I think it makes it pretty problematic in actually taking that book seriously on any of its given accounts. So, what are the main themes? And I'm going to look for common denominator main themes, where no matter how you take this book, what can you get from it? And the first one is this dual yin-yang version of judgment and redemption. We see that hand in hand throughout this entire book, no matter if you're talking about its time and place currently, what it was trying to guess at for the future, and then how far that future is or is not, and if it included any messianic purposes within it. Still, judgment and redemption. For who exactly, for how long and when? Not so clear. Despite what I just said about the common denominator, I do think we have to say just because the Christians take it so much like this, that the second theme would have to be some kind of messianic hope. There is no getting around that a large number of Christians believe very surely that Isaiah is definitely and only about the coming Messiah that would be found in Jesus Christ. We see the Bible writers trying to make that so. It is definitely just its own whole thing, and what the book would really be known as if you left it just to the typical Christian. A couple more quick themes might be like God's covenant or faithfulness. So much of this is, I think, kind of coping for the time that it was written with everything that is coming against us. Look at all our enemies closing in, or look at us in exile, or look at us trying to rebuild, and relying on God to still be faithful with what these people believed that he had promised them. And then lastly would be like holiness and righteousness. Again, especially with the throne room vision of Isaiah, we see that's where we first hear that the angels floating around him just screaming over and over, holy, holy, holy. It's a deafening sound that is being described here. Isaiah is taken aback at just the true magnitude of God's glory and holiness. And a lot of those kinds of concepts come straight from this book. So point 6, reception and influence. I'm beating a dead horse. I am just being too redundant, but it's going to completely depend on to whom. If we were talking about to the Jews, they have been able to, for a very long time, look at this book and not tie it into Jesus, not even expect him. Then when he got here, not map it onto him and still expect some other future messianic king to come. The Christians have taken this book and ran with it. Look, this is it. This is talking about his birth. This is talking about his death. This is our God, nothing else. This is Jesus. Look how well it fits. Look at the Gospels. In fact, this is the 5th Gospel. That is a very popular Christian claim, that because it speaks about Jesus so much, we should be considering this the 5th Gospel. So the impact on Christian theology from this book alone is paramount. I mean, even the definite idea of redemption or atonement through this figure that is prophesied about is immense. And lastly, this, of course, even outside of the religious aspects, trickles into media, storytelling, movies, music. I mean, Handel's Messiah has major quotes from the book of Isaiah, even ongoing influence when we look at the book of Revelation, trying to tie things back into Isaiah. I mean, it created so much of the initial apocalyptic ideals about what the future of this religion and God's eternal plan for it is or will be. I know this has been a lot, and trust me, I've left out a lot. And so if you're like, oh man, I was hoping you talk about this or that, sorry, high level here, really just want to major in the majors. Let's talk though about some contradictions, some problems with prophecy, and some problematic passages. That's a mouthful there. So contradictions, what do we have? Well, once again, it determines how you look at this book. So maybe we can start without looking at the specific verses, just kind of different things the book promises. We have a contradictory nature between how harsh God's punishment will be, how total it will be, by the way, complete destruction of things that we don't see completely destroyed, but also just bumping against the concepts of freedom and redemption that are promised and offered, almost like these two things can't exist in the same capacity. We get conflating statements about Israel itself, how loved it is by God, how chosen it is, how righteous or wicked, how hopeless or hopeful. We see many different things written in kind of a hyperbolic state about this people group or its future potential, if you will. We have in this book conflating claims about the nature of God as pure love and justice, but also as the arbiter and creator of evil. We have issues with if God is keeping or breaking or extending or renewing his covenant, what Israel's part in that has been, etc. There's a lot of things we could dive into and say, well, this doesn't seem right, or this seems counter to what God said would always be. So again, we need more time, but those are like some of the broad ones. Let's give you a few specifics before we move into prophecies. In Isaiah 11, 6 through 9, we see a promise of peace, even the animals getting along, the nations no longer fighting and totally unified. But in 24, 1 through 23, we see this total apocalyptic vision, very different, no peace. This would be fine if we're talking about different periods of time or if we're talking about one thing leading to another, but that's not really the way these verses are stating it. Even in the nature of the Messiah, if this book even does talk about the Messiah, when you're thinking that Isaiah 53 is about the Messiah, it's the suffering servant. But back in Isaiah 9, 6 through 7, we are talking more about a triumphal king, almost like Isaiah is predicting two different different people, or that these claims have been stretched to mean whatever you want them to mean, or taken as far as to both be meaning about Jesus himself. Again, there's a lot here, but I think the biggest contradictions come in when we start looking at the prophecies and the issues with prophecy. So let's talk about that and end with some problematic passages. I think first it's important to note that no one can even agree on how many prophecies are in the book of Isaiah. I think that's a problem. I think we should be able to know there's exactly 18. Here's exactly what they say. Here's exactly what they are referring to, so that we can say it either has happened, has yet to happen, could not have happened, or the time for that to work is past and thus it's falsifiable. I think that that's not too much to ask for if we're actually supposed to be able to utilize these prophecies to know something important, like, I don't know, who the Messiah is and if indeed that person does or does not offer salvation. But maybe that's just me being too picky. It seems like if you were trying to, you could pull over 60 separate prophecies from this book. But again, what those prophecies are, how many there are indeed, who they're referring to, and in what time period is very, very difficult to say. We have prophecies about the virgin birth. We have prophecies about the Messianic king himself, about his death, maybe, about the fall of Babylon, about an Assyrian attack, about a Babylonian exile, about the restoration of Israel, even about John the Baptist, and many of those multiples, maybe. So, am I going to be able to go through all 60 plus and explain why they are, why they aren't, how they fit, how they don't? No, but let's talk about how easy it is to identify some of the issues with these prophecies. I think that using Isaiah 7 is the perfect way to do so. Isaiah 7 is where we get the idea that the Messianic Savior will be from a virgin birth. The issue is, we know in the Hebrew there's better words that could have been used than Alma to mean virgin. Alma meant young woman or childbearing age woman. The problem is the gospel writers, like the anonymous writer of Matthew, is working off of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And the Septuagint put the word instead of Alma with Parthenos, which means virgin. So when the writer of Matthew is reading what the Messiah should be, this person thinks, due to an incorrectly translated Septuagint, that the Messiah should come from a virgin, and so then writes that into their gospel. This is proof not only of how colluding the gospel writers were to get certain things from the Old Testament to map correctly, but just how easy it is for things to fail in translation. Even many Bibles today have replaced virgin in Isaiah here with young woman, though they all try to make a side note back to the fact that it could be a virgin. Also, this is totally aside from that. There's no reason to believe that this prediction being made had anything to do with someone far in the future. Quite the contrary, actually. We know the context of this prophecy. It is Isaiah talking to King Ahaz. They're talking here about joining an alliance or not joining an alliance because they're under siege by Syria, etc. This is Isaiah promising Ahaz that God will destroy his enemies. When? Within the time frame it takes for an Alma to give birth to a baby, a young woman to give birth to a baby. The child's name would be Emmanuel, which means God with us, not God himself, and that threat from the enemy kings would be dealt with before that child grew up. That is a prophecy for that time and place, not hundreds of years in the future with Jesus. If it was 7 centuries later, of what benefit would that have been to King Ahaz, who wanted the fighting to be over now? Like, in his lifetime, which is what Isaiah is talking about. We even have details about that child that we know wouldn't make it Jesus, like the reference to eating cream and honey, like how the land had just been ravaged by the Assyrians and they had to eat this cultivated food instead of, say, bread and wine. Furthermore, if this is supposed to be Jesus, then who are the 2 kings that are referenced here? Whose kingdoms are supposed to be abandoned during Jesus's lifetime then? It just doesn't make any sense. And so I spent a little more time with this one to just show you how something that Christians just take, they absolutely assert it as truth, they bake it into their Christmas songs, has a history that we can know, having clear manipulation like seeing Alma mistranslated in the Septuagint and then used to show the fulfillment of prophecy in the anonymous gospel writings. We have the historical context from the Assyrians to know what was going on at the time as to why that prophecy wouldn't have made any sense for the purpose that it was done. By the way, most prophecy at this time, even biblically speaking, was never meant to be for millennia. It was supposed to be useful to the person at that time. Like Isaiah telling Ahaz that within his reign and within this very threat, this is what will happen and on what time frame. It was supposed to be helpful, not eternally vague to be used at any given time in the future. Someone wants to try to tie things together. So again, problems galore with taking anything as prophecy ever, anywhere in the world from any source, but especially biblical prophecy, especially from one book that we can see has been so corrupted, not useful, straight up incorrect, or misused. Sometimes it's just as simple as the one we get from Isaiah 17:1, where it talks about Damascus being a heap of rubble, that it will no longer be a city. Well, that's false. Damascus is still inhabited even today. There's like 1 million people. That's not a totally destroyed city that is left to rubble and ruin. In Isaiah 19:4-5, we get something about how the Nile will be dried up. False. And you can go and look these up for yourself. And yeah, there's going to be a ton of contention online from different apologetics, whether it be Christians who don't agree with themselves, or Catholics who don't agree with themselves, or Jewish people who don't agree with themselves, or between those three groups. But if we're being consistent and fair in how we take these things, how we do interpret this book into who Isaiah was talking and about what, there are certain ones we know fail. In Isaiah 52:1, we're told that the uncircumcised will never enter Israel again. That's just not true. You could make it vaguely metaphorically true, but then you have to make a lot of these other things vague metaphors. Well, that doesn't work. We wanted the vague metaphors that point to Jesus to be intentionally, specifically, descriptively true. Well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. The area of Babylon did not become a total wasteland as described in Isaiah 13. There's a whole lot of confusion in terms of what Isaiah meant about King Cyrus, if that's supposedly who he was talking about, and even looking like he was predicting Cyrus to be the Messiah. In Isaiah 13 and also in Isaiah 34, we get imminent destruction, not just destruction, apocalyptic destruction, not future-based, current, soon happening, this lifetime. Lots of context around that, lots of reasons to know the apocalypse didn't happen. No stars falling from the sky, no heavens shaking. I talked earlier about the peaceful kingdom prophecy from Isaiah 11. Nope. What about the universal knowledge of God as promised in Isaiah 45 and in Isaiah 11:9? I hate to break it to you, we still have a lot of religious diversity. The regathering talked about in Isaiah 11 did not happen. Yeah, we had some post-exile groups of Jews going back to the homeland, but many did not. Issues with Edom's perpetual desolation as in Isaiah 34, the end of sacrifices and temple destruction in Isaiah 66, the universal peace in Isaiah 2, Zion's perpetual joy in Isaiah 35, the fate of Moab in Isaiah 15-16, Jerusalem's immutability in Isaiah 52, and again the big one with the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. You can see there's plenty to talk about and still more, but I've given you a lot of issues with the prophecies of Isaiah. As always, let's end with some problematic passages, but not too many because I know we spent extra time with all the prophecy stuff. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the one I bring up all the time, Isaiah 45:7. God is the creator of evil. And I always get two responses when I bring this up. Duh, Brandon, we know that God made everything, while not addressing what that really means when you think about it. That a God who was all-powerful, meaning he could create a world with no evil, chose to create a world with evil. And if you're going to be so limiting to saying that God could only create a world where he could show love by giving freedom of free will that led to evil, you're wrong. It didn't just lead to it. God claims he created it right here in this book. And an all-powerful God still could have given us all of those goods without any of the bads. He could have. If you don't believe he could have, you don't believe in an all-powerful God. It's very simple. And then you have the second kind of believer that just refuses to accept this. Well, okay, God didn't create evil. There's one translation that says calamity, like, tornadoes. Not a good excuse, by the way. And calamity is not as accurate a translation as evil. It's also not the only time the Bible does this. We see in Job the accounting of God being the one who chose to do evil. Yeah, but he didn't really create evil. He created Satan, who made his own choices, and through his fall, evil just happened. It's a cop-out. And it's also not what this God is claiming. In Isaiah 13:15-18, we get more baby dashing, just like what we talked about in Psalms. And we already talked about it to a large extent, but it is again here. Also, in this exact same set of verses, we get where the wives will be ravished. It's always fun of God to be able to put the child murder right next to the innocent woman's rape as a consequence for sin and something that he is happy of and his people are happy of that he is commanding. What more evidence do you need that this God is not a good God if he definitely were to even exist? I know I've said this before, and this is probably the wrong video to do it because not as many of you even watch Secular Bible Study Series, and we're very far into this one, so this will be lost on just a few ears, but I cannot get over how if we tried to make these situations real today, Christians could not and would not accept them. How many Christians today would not follow the voice of the Lord if he said, go dash babies among rocks, be happy and gleeful about it, and rape those women? So when you think back to an Israelite soldier being willing to do this, do you think they were someone who was different than you? They weren't. So you're either better than them, like you've morally developed further than even the God of the Bible, or you are someone who would be willing and gleeful to do this if the Lord commanded. And that's even scarier. The religion could so corrupt your morality where you would take this might makes right and do the most horrendous and atrocious thing. As long as there is a God that at any point in his history decided this was the beneficial and right thing to do, we have a God that is extremely problematic, even according to his own standard. In Isaiah 34, 2-3, we see more of this genocidal nature of total and complete destruction for punishment, collective punishment. Isaiah 45:9 is where we get the whole clay and potter imagery. We're the clay, he's the potter, he can do whatever he wants with us, is the idea here, that God's sovereignty is total and complete. There's a lot of tension between God's sovereignty and man's freedom or free will. Once again, it seems like the kind of thing you just can't have it both ways. We have in this very book God boasting about that time he raised up an army from the Persians to conquer the Babylonians for his purpose of getting his people back to their holy place. Think about all the non-human agency that had to go on for these other two non-biblical groups to just be pawns in God's great master chess game. And the whole reason that he even allowed the Babylonian captivity in the first place was as punishment. He brags about that in this too. He says, you think I just walked out on you? No, I chose directly to punish you with this time in exile. And I also, through my good graces and sovereignty, constructed the Persian uprooting of Babylon for you. That is just God doing whatever the hell he wants. So if he's doing this, then what happened to all that free will excuse for his other claim in this very book about being the creator of evil? You just can't have it all the different ways. This is an evil God who does not give total free will, who intervenes whenever he wants, however he wants, usually in the most destructive and unforgiving way possible, even to those who have nothing to do with the initial conflict. It's just him and his chosen group, and within that chosen group, really just the men. It's just him and the men of these chosen group, and everyone else, their kids, their wives, and the outsiders are all just collateral damage and pieces of his master puzzle. Gross. Isaiah 64:6 is where we get that horrendous thing about being as filthy rags that even our good deeds don't count at all. We're just these broken people who can never do right. We're worthless without God. Good job, God. You made a creation that you despise, that you will only tolerate under certain ridiculous conditions like blood magic and child sacrifice. Let me know what else you would have added, anything I got wrong, anything you want to correct, anything you want to add, any additional context, any more prophecy stuff, contradiction stuff, problematic passage stuff, any questions. Let's hear it all in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you on Sunday with my next video, and until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support, my Iconoclast, GVI, Jacob, Jason, Oliver, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod and Kristi, and my Atheist advocates, Ann, Elijah, Rokkit, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in my mission, or you just enjoy watching the content, please consider joining these fine patrons. Thanks, and have a great day.